Welcome, Catalina. So
Thanks.
today we are going to talk about racism in sex. And for those who haven't met you, Dr. Catalina has over 20 years of experience as a clinical psychologist. She is a researcher and a professor as well in the field of sexual health. She has worked all across the globe. And she's also been a part of a reading research team in the development of Aviva, the first sex therapy for Latina cancer survivors. And she's also the host of the Sex Marks the Spot podcast. So welcome, Dr. Catalina.
Thanks for
Um,
having me.
yeah, thank you for being here. I'd love for you to also give like a brief introduction about where your work focuses, and especially in the realm of racism in sex, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been doing health disparity research since '98, and mostly in as looking at health disparities within the context of health. And so throughout this, probably about 15 years ago, my work really started focusing mostly on couples and sexuality and communication, again, within the context of health, specifically within cancer. And and then throughout that, a lot of my work just kind of intersected where, because I do a lot of work with recent immigrants and African Americans here in America, but then I also do a lot of work with Southeast Asians in over abroad. And so a lot of my work has really started looking in my research, looking at some of the sociocultural factors that influence sexual concerns and specifically management of sexual changes after cancer. Or in my private practice, a lot of I would say 70 to 80% of my clients are people of color and primarily first generation immigrants. And so much of my work really focuses a lot on, I guess, matching and navigating a lot of the sociocultural differences. Particularly the majority of my clients, and I think this is what we'll talk about today, are in relationships with individuals, primarily Caucasians, or individuals who are from different cultures, and figuring out how to navigate that, and then I think on our podcast, we talked a little bit how dating shifts and how a lot of these racial stereotypes actually influence our choices in potential partners and our perceived attractiveness and things like that. So a lot of my work really focuses on inherently, I think, there's just not as many mental health providers and specifically psychologists who are people of color. So I work with patients in New York, Illinois, and California. And so inherent in that, because people come to me because of my background and my experience, we talk a lot about sociocultural factors and how they actually come in our relationships. And certainly at the core of that is our sexuality, but then also how much a lot of in our day-to-day, how much of, systems actually influence systems in the government, systems in healthcare, but then also systems at work, how all of those actually maintain and foster a lot of systemic racism. So that's a little bit about how this all kind of, so much is actually just kind of synthesized. A lot of my own experience, a lot of my research, and then a lot of my clinical work. And then all of it I've been really fortunate over the last several years. A lot of it is just kind of synthesized together.
Yeah. I mean, it's all so interconnected. And I feel like how our society interacts, like, for example, we're both in America. So how our various social situations play out has to do with those entrenched systems that we were raised within.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about sex and dating, as you mentioned. For example, I guess we could start at the beginning, more in the sex side of things. How does racism, and for those people who are experiencing the effects of racism, how does that affect someone's ability to connect with or command their sexuality?
Well, I think that there's a lot of factors that come into that, and then they seep in at lots of different levels. But at the core of when we talk about racism is perceived power or control. And specifically in relationships, and at the core of our sexuality is our perceived control. And to fully enhance and experience it, you actually have to feel safe. And when there are hierarchies or perceived differentials, that's where safety can be compromised. And that can not only be perceived, but certainly is also experiential, behavioral, you know? So I think it comes out of a lot of different ways. One, considering a lot of the stereotypes that are particularly amongst minorities, and depending on where you are in the world, what you end up finding is if you look at is that the same stereotypes that actually foster racial oppression come into relationships. You see it with, if you think about social exchange theory, you think about, oh, I'm looking for partners who can actually help me gear up or heighten me or strengthen myself in the hierarchy, right? So racially, you're looking for partners who, this is why people oftentimes, more conservative individuals or people in more homogenous cultures are going to date within their own race. That the opposite side of that is that people who are outside of that race aren't going to actually, don't feel or don't report like they have as much opportunity or perceived as attractive or are seen as viable options as much, you know? And so there you have the perceived opportunity on both sides really being influenced, you know? And so a lot of the research when we were thinking about dating has been really looking at online dating preferences. And again, that's where a lot of most research has shown that it falls in line with a lot of the racial stereotypes. And even amongst biracial individuals who you would think would be more open to dating maybe outside of their race, they actually still are more likely to stay within their race. Again, and I think that there are a lot of factors to this. In general, particularly in America, you know, there's so much systemic segregation that one of the biggest reasons, even with online dating, people connect is proximity. You know, that when you pass people, you see them out. And when there is, I mean, I just moved from Chicago and I was raised in the South. When there is systemic division, where you're not integrated. And now I live on the West Side where there actually isn't a lot of people of color in LA. Even though LA is such a diverse city, it actually is still pretty segregated. You know, Latinos are definitely not living as much in the West Side. I mean, it's so that's where you also see you're not going to see as much diversity in who people are actually having opportunities to meet. You know, so you see it in all these different levels, but at the core, when I think of the individual, I very much think that so much comes down to your perceived power and voice in that relationship, and internally safety, how much you have. And I think that's where a lot of racial stereotypes and isms come in. And actually, and again, when we think about this on the individual level, how our brains make sense of that very much influence how we see ourselves and how our identity is, and how we feel we can actually engage in a relationship, not even just sexually, but how assertive we can be, period. You know, and I think that that's where so much of this, where you see so much of the disparities happening. And it's interesting because I was writing something a few months ago and I was looking again at the research, and you don't always see, it's really hard to tease out racial differences as far as sexual assault and things like that. Because again, what you also see is that people who are from in America, oftentimes they're not reporting as much either. They're much less likely, ethnic minorities are much less likely to report any type of sexual harassment or assault across in workplaces, in relationships, across the board. And so this is where it's sometimes hard to look at that data when you don't think about it within a whole system.
Totally. Totally. So this makes a lot of sense. And then additionally, you had mentioned dating apps. Um, the first thing that comes to my mind is this like perceived notion of what beauty is and how that's so like white centric. And do you think that that plays a huge part in like the stereotypes of like what is beautiful and what is not beautiful and what is attractive or sexy? How does that affect someone who's a person of color or maybe just not falling into those realms of like beautiful or sexy,
Oh,
trying to think
100%.
about and dating?
100%. Well, again, I think that you see it across throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
Whiter is more attractive across every culture. Every culture wants to be lighter skinned, except for white people, it seems like. No, but like, and so there is generally a perceived attractiveness within that falls along those lines, you know. And this is what's interesting is that there was one study with done with gay men. On I forget which app it was, but they were looking at how much when somebody actually stated their racial preference in their profile, how much that influenced how dateable they were and would they actually swipe right on them. And the results showed that, oh no, they assumed, even though they just said that they prefer Latin men or black men, that they would perceive them as racist, but what it didn't affect was their perceived attractiveness. They wouldn't date them, but they still rated them as attractive as they normally would, regardless of that, you know? But again, I think that that's where this is where you look at, okay, how are we actually making our choices? Because when you're asking somebody, oh, what are you attracted to? Like, what's your type? You know, that's where, again, sometimes people will be like, oh, I like exotic, and that's where there are, but what does that actually mean? What is inherent in exotic? Does that, and you got to be mindful, inherent in that is also a little demure and maybe submissive. And this is where you get more into, oh, yellow fever or all of those other things that come into the biases that we have that are very much racial based, you know.
Yeah.
So attractiveness in general definitely fits, particularly in Western countries, and again, not even just in Western countries, particularly, I mean, when you look across all cultures, there is very much the Caucasian you know, ideal, and with facial features, chisels, and skin color, everything, the way we wear our hair, all of those has always repeatedly, and it has not changed much at all, has consistently been, that's the norm for attractiveness. And the thing with online dating is that the algorithm is match a same level of attractiveness, essentially. And so what ends up happening is the people who don't fit those norms don't actually, again, get opportunity to even meet those people.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to get swiped out pretty quickly.
We had a question about, and you've definitely touched on it, how this all plays into sexual preference and having like the ability to list a race that is your sexual preference. I can see that if you are, maybe if it's a matter of safety and feeling safe with a person, totally see that. And I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good point. And then if it was person, for example, say a Caucasian person listing a race as their sexual preference, is that racist, or is that like fetishizing?
Well, and I do think that this is where I flat out, I actually don't think the research has teased this out nearly enough. I think that our understanding of fetishes has for so long been from a pathological standpoint, like seeing it as such the norm rather than, okay, now actually people are talking about it. Because people have preferences, period. And considering and access to more um, inherent in porn and social media or whatever, you get more ideas, you know? So I guess when we're thinking about that, again, this is where people will, the people who actually see it as, oh, I have this preference, the people who state it, they, again, it's kind of like the I'm not racist comment. They actually generally do not see it as, oh, I'm being referenced. They generally just see it as a preference, and that fetish is, that's just my preference. What has not been teased out is what is underlying that. And, you know, and I think that that's really where we need to go further. But then how do you get at that? Because again, so much of this is people's perceptions. And I think that when it comes to things like race, it is actually very hard. This is why you need to look at so much more implicit biases in this type of research, because most people will not say, again, going back to that study I just cited, like they'll say, oh no, that I won't like them. They must be racist if they're talking about their racial preferences, but they're hot. And again, like, so what's the take home there? Don't write your racial preferences. Like that's what ends up people learning from particularly online dating. Or then those that comes up to rules like, oh, I'm only going to date Asians, but I'm not going to say that. Like, you know, and that's ends up because all you need is a few people now talking about it and learning. Oh, people may take it that way. And then now you have a different way of actually, that strategy may be, they're going to learn. People only do things over and over and over if it works for them and it gives them some kind of pleasure. So again, like people are going to learn that, oh, I don't need to present it this way, but I'm always going to focus on this type for whatever reason, you know? And so that's where I feel like it's really important to tangle that. And the thing I think with fetishes is that there already is, or they're perceived within a paradigm of, oh, this is so not the norm. And it's already such a negative connotation that I guess I'm like, we need to understand that better, and really just look at preferences, period.
Right. So we have a person that asked, there's a couple questions. The first
Okay.
one is from Joseph. He wrote, or they wrote, is there really a type, or is this just physical? So that's a good question. They also continued saying yellow fever for women, jungle fever for men. But again, is this just physical?
Well, and again, I guess this is where ask the people, what does that actually mean? Because I mean, I think I told you, did I tell you about how I didn't ever hear yellow fever until probably about 5 years ago. And when I was living in Australia, I'd never, ever been referred to. And I was on a date and some guy was like, oh, are you done with your yellow fever? And I was like, oh, is he talking about me? Like, I was like, I don't know. And honestly, I guess I know that I've absolutely been objectified in that, oh, you're Asian, you must be this. So inherent in what a person looks like, and particularly when you're talking race or ethnicity, there are underlying assumptions that you're going to make, you know? And again, this is where so much of the polarities happen, you know, with like jungle fever or yellow fever. Like, oh, you're either like a geisha or like, you know, like a ping ponger or and highly sexualized, or you're completely shut down from it, you know? And that's what you see across all minorities is and yet with Caucasians, then there's a spectrum. But when you think about with minorities, that's where you see, like, because it's not like there's actually specific terms or euphemisms people use that, rather than, oh, this person's just a slut or something like that. You know, that's where race does come into it. So I would say, yes, there's there probably is some physical traits that people are looking into, but that's where the stereotypes, and that's what keeps coming out, is there are definitely the racial stereotypes that are underlying what that person is going to be like sexually.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about it, but you're so right that for anyone aside from people who are white, there is just like completely a dichotomy versus a spectrum. And yeah, I guess that leads to my next question that I have. Is there a way, and this is maybe totally bigger than we can possibly tackle, but is there a way that we can start breaking those down? Like how can people start reclaiming their sexuality and be a part of that spectrum and like understand their place on that spectrum?
Well, and this is really where I think we're just very early. As much as we are talking about racism now, a lot of these studies that I've been talking about, have been done over the last decade. And this is the thing is so much is bit by bit, and being realistic as to where we are. I mean, I think the biggest thing that the Me Too really revealed was, yep, this is the reality. Yes, I mean, and this is why when the whole Harriet Tubman thing happened with Trump, I was just like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, I mean, yes, so much has shifted when it comes to racism. And yet there is so much inherent in the humanity, in just human existence, that the one difference with race is it is the first thing you are going to see, no matter what time of day it is. And no matter where you are, it's the first thing you're going to see about someone. And then your brain is already going to categorize it somehow. So I do feel like inherent in this, obviously there's systemic things that need to happen, but individually, I do think we have to heighten our consciousness so that, because all of these things that are going on, all those stereotypes we've been talking about are automatic, but they were learned. And when you think about how many people, I mean, all of us are living most of our lives totally on autopilot, totally just going through the day. And I think that, and we know that with online dating in particular, this is why they've been trying different ways of, like, I think Meet Mindful, like, tries to put up a pop-up. Think before you just swipe left on someone, because we know that actually the automaticity, it's like a video game. It becomes like online shopping. And when people go to bars, it's the same kind of thing. And so you see that the way people make connections is super automatic. And so heightening people's awareness and consciousness to be present so that they actually can then realize they're making a choice. That's where I do think that it works in all directions. A choice in that I don't have to live by whatever norms or stereotypes that have been imposed or that I was just born with, that they're just there and I fit that bill. And then, I don't have to live by that. But then on the other, I don't actually have to just assume someone is this just on that. I can actually start with a clean slate and get curious. So I feel like so much is like heightening that consciousness to the moment on all sides, and I guess particularly now when everything just seems like it is going to shit, that and in relationships and our sexuality in particular, all everyone is looking for is real connection, that it has to start with ourselves. We have to be connected to ourselves. We have to be conscious, and start there, and then learn, and then try, getting curious. I'm all for getting curious. And like with all of these things, it's kind of like when you're talking about the fetishes. Okay, well, if you actually are going to see it as, oh, this is taboo, well, you know what? Try it out. And then and then realize how taboo it is, like, it's kind of like, I just think, I mean, it's kind of like when people pathologize BDSM. Oh, they must want to be submissive. And I've
Right.
very much worked and been in environments where, yeah, someone is on their knees, and I'm like, and they are treated with so much respect and trust. And I'm like, there's a choice, and everyone gets to make their choice, and it may look whatever they want it to look like. You know, I mean, again, people have rape fetishes. And do I think that that's appropriate for everyone? I don't. Again, I'm not even going to make blanket statements like that because I don't know what the hell's going on in that moment for that person, what their choice is, you know? And so I guess I just think so much of this needs to be in those moments of choice.
Yes, that is beautiful. And almost exactly bringing us to 30 minutes.
Okay.
I think that is the perfect place to end it. Just the internalizing the reflection and the mindful reflection when you're swiping, when you're on a date, when you're in a sexual encounter, etc. It's exactly what we talk about here at My Sex Bio, and it's so important. And thank you so much for being with us. So for everyone that's here with us and watching, and we're gonna post it on our account later. So if you're watching now, this is all gonna be continued and built upon in our episode of Carnal Theory. We are so excited to be partnering with you, Dr. Catalina. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being on our episode of Carnal Theory earlier. And thank you so much. Is there any last words you wanted to say?
No, and again, I love that. I love the space that you guys are fostering in the community. So very much like happy to be a part of it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here in the wonderful comments.
Awesome.
See you all later on our next Instagram Live.
Cool. Bye. Have a good